The Brass Rail stood as one of downtown's most celebrated establishments, its polished wooden doors welcoming both the elite and everyday patrons for over 3 decades. On this particular Monday morning, Marcus Thompson adjusted his new black vest in front of the employee bathroom mirror, his confident smirk reflecting back at him. At 26, he considered himself one of the city's finest mixologists, despite having only 3 years of experience at a modest bar in the suburbs. "You must be the new guy," a voice called out as Marcus emerged from the bathroom. Sarah, the morning shift supervisor, extended her hand with a welcoming smile. Her experienced eyes had seen countless bartenders come and go over her 8 years at the Brass Rail. "That's right. Marcus Thompson, but you can call me Mark. I was the head bartender at the Purple Lounge," he replied, his chest puffing slightly as he mentioned his previous workplace. Sarah's eyebrows raised slightly. The Purple Lounge was known as a decent but unremarkable establishment in the suburbs. The morning training session began with Sarah showing Marcus around the extensive bar area. The Brass Rail wasn't just any bar. It boasted 3 separate serving stations, each meticulously organized with top-shelf spirits and craft ingredients. While Sarah explained their inventory system, Marcus occasionally interrupted with comments about how he would have arranged things differently. "At the Purple Lounge, we kept the premium vodkas at eye level. It's better for upselling," he stated matter-of-factly, while Sarah patiently continued with the training. As the afternoon approached and the first customers began trickling in, Marcus's confidence grew increasingly obvious. He barely paid attention when Sarah introduced him to the regular customers, instead focusing on arranging his station according to his preferences, much to the annoyance of his fellow bartenders. "Just remember, every customer here matters," Sarah emphasized, noticing how Marcus's eyes kept drifting toward the more fashionably dressed patrons. "The Brass Rail has built its reputation on making everyone feel welcome." Marcus nodded absently, already formulating his own plans. In his mind, he wasn't just another bartender. He was going to revolutionize the Brass Rail's cocktail menu and show everyone what real bartending looked like. The evening rush began, and Marcus found himself in his element, or so he thought. He flourished bottles with unnecessary flair, drawing attention to himself while preparing even the simplest drinks. Some younger customers seemed impressed, but his theatrical performances were slowing down service considerably. "Hey, hotshot," Jake, another bartender, called out. "We've got people waiting. Maybe tone down the show a bit." Marcus just laughed it off, convinced that his style was superior. As the night progressed, Marcus continued to prioritize customers he deemed important, the ones in expensive clothes or those he thought would leave better tips. He barely noticed when an older man in a worn leather jacket took a seat at the far end of the bar, waiting patiently to order. "I'll take care of that one later," Marcus muttered to himself, focusing instead on a group of young professionals in business attire who had just arrived. "Welcome to the Brass Rail. What can I craft for you today?" he announced cheerfully, completely ignoring the man in the leather jacket. Sarah noticed this from across the bar and frowned. She started to move toward the neglected customer, but was caught up with her own orders. The man in the leather jacket continued to wait patiently, observing everything with quiet interest. At the end of his first shift, Marcus was counting his tips with satisfaction. He had made good money, though mostly from the customers he had chosen to focus on. When Sarah approached him for the closing review, he was already launching into ideas about changing their cocktail menu. "First day, and I can already see some improvements we could make," he declared confidently. "The Purple Lounge's signature drinks would really elevate this place." Sarah listened silently, her expression unreadable. She had seen this type before, talented but overconfident bartenders who thought they knew everything about the business after a few years behind a small-town bar. Little did Marcus know, his attitude had not gone unnoticed, and his first day would set in motion a series of events that would change his perspective forever. As Marcus left through the employee entrance that night, the man in the leather jacket was having a quiet conversation with Sarah in the office, making notes in a small notebook. The first pieces of an unforgettable lesson were already falling into place, though Marcus wouldn't realize it until it was too late. The second week at the Brass Rail proved busier than Marcus's first. The bar was gaining even more popularity due to an ongoing business convention in town, and the influx of well-dressed executives made Marcus even more selective about whom he chose to serve first. Every evening around 7, the man in the worn leather jacket would appear, taking his usual spot at the far end of the bar. Marcus had begun referring to him as corner guy when talking to other staff members, making little effort to hide his disdain for what he considered a low-value customer. "Just another whiskey, neat," the man would say quietly when he finally got Marcus's attention. "No fancy cocktails, no premium spirits, just regular whiskey." Marcus would barely acknowledge him, sliding the drink across the bar without making eye contact before rushing off to serve more promising customers. Sarah noticed this pattern continuing and pulled Marcus aside one evening. "That gentleman you keep ignoring. He's been coming here longer than you've been old enough to drink," she said firmly. Marcus shrugged off her concern. "Look, Sarah, I know you mean well, but I understand customer dynamics. The suits are ordering top-shelf cocktails and leaving 20% tips. Corner guy nurses one whiskey for an hour. It's just business," Marcus replied, his tone dismissive. That evening, the leather jacket-wearing customer observed an interesting scene unfold. A young woman approached the bar, clearly upset after an argument with her date. While other bartenders were busy, Marcus was wiping glasses and chose to ignore her obvious distress, instead focusing on a group of executives ordering expensive shots. The man in the leather jacket watched as tears welled up in the woman's eyes. He quietly stood up, walked over to her, and offered his seat. "The edge of the bar is quieter," he said kindly, "and sometimes a quiet spot is what we need most." Marcus witnessed this interaction from the corner of his eye but remained unimpressed. "Probably trying to hit on her," he muttered to Jake, who shot him a disapproving look. Later that night, Sarah approached the man in the leather jacket. Their conversation was hushed, but their glances toward Marcus made it clear who they were discussing. Marcus noticed but convinced himself they were probably just another pair of people who didn't understand modern bartending. The next day, Marcus arrived for his shift to find a new directive posted in the staff room. All customers were to be served in order of arrival, no exceptions. He scoffed at the notice, considering it a suggestion rather than a rule. During that evening's rush, the leather jacket man arrived as usual, but this time he wasn't alone. An elderly woman accompanied him, wearing simple but neat clothes. They sat in his usual corner, and Marcus immediately categorized them as another pair of time-wasting customers. 20 minutes passed before Marcus acknowledged them, despite the bar being only moderately busy. When he finally approached, his demeanor was cold and professional at best. "What can I get you?" he asked, his tone making it clear they were interrupting his evening. "2 whiskeys, neat, please," the man replied, maintaining his usual calm demeanor. The woman with him watched Marcus intently, making notes in a small notebook. "Coming right up," Marcus replied flatly, turning away before the man could say anything else. Behind him, he heard the woman whisper something to her companion, who nodded gravely. Throughout the evening, Marcus continued his pattern of prioritizing certain customers while neglecting others. He failed to notice how the woman in the corner was documenting every interaction, every dismissed customer, and every display of preferential treatment. As the night drew to a close, Sarah approached Marcus with an unusual request. "Tomorrow, there's a mandatory staff meeting before opening. Mr. Morrison wants everyone present." "Mr. Morrison?" Marcus asked, realizing he had never heard the name before. "The owner," Sarah replied simply, turning away before Marcus could ask more questions. That night, as Marcus counted his tips and congratulated himself on another successful evening of strategic customer service, he remained oblivious to the fact that his actions over the past 2 weeks had been carefully observed and documented. The meeting tomorrow would change everything, but for now, his confidence remained unshaken, his attitude unchanged, and his lessons still unlearned. Friday night at the Brass Rail was typically the busiest evening of the week, and this particular Friday was no exception. The bar was packed with a mix of regular patrons, young professionals unwinding after work, and visitors from the ongoing business convention. Marcus was in his element, or so he thought, putting on an elaborate show for the customers he deemed worthy of his attention. The man in the leather jacket arrived at his usual time, taking his familiar spot at the corner of the bar. Tonight, however, would prove different from all the previous encounters. The tension that had been building over the past 2 weeks was about to reach its breaking point. As the evening rush hit its peak, Marcus was juggling multiple orders, deliberately prioritizing the flashier customers while ignoring others. The leather jacket man raised his hand politely, attempting to catch Marcus's attention. Despite making direct eye contact, Marcus turned away, pretending not to see him. "Excuse me," the man called out, his voice slightly louder than usual but still maintaining its calm tone. "I've been waiting for 20 minutes. Marcus, who was in the middle of preparing an elaborate cocktail for a group of young executives, rolled his eyes visibly. Yeah, just wait your turn," he called back, his voice dripping with irritation. Several nearby customers turned to observe the exchange, uncomfortable with Marcus's obvious disrespect. Sarah, who was working the other end of the bar, noticed the interaction and started moving toward them, but the bar was too crowded for her to intervene quickly enough. The situation was about to escalate in a way nobody expected. After finishing his elaborate cocktail presentation, Marcus finally approached the man, slamming a napkin down on the bar. "What can I get you?" he asked, his tone making it clear that this interaction was an unwelcome interruption to his evening. "Whiskey neat, please," the man replied, maintaining his composure despite Marcus's attitude. Marcus snorted, eyeing the man's worn leather jacket. "You know, we have some actually premium spirits if you want to try something that matches the establishment's standards," he said loudly enough for nearby customers to hear. The comment hung in the air like a heavy cloud, creating an uncomfortable silence in their corner of the bar. The man in the leather jacket sat perfectly still for a moment, studying Marcus with an intensity that should have served as a warning. "Just the regular whiskey will be fine," he replied, his voice carrying a new edge that Marcus failed to notice. "Sure thing," Marcus replied with exaggerated politeness. "One bottom shelf special coming right up for our favorite corner regular." He turned to wink at a group of well-dressed customers nearby, expecting them to appreciate his wit. Instead, they looked away, embarrassed by his behavior. As Marcus slid the whiskey across the bar with unnecessary force, causing some to spill, he added one final jab. "You know, most people dress up a bit when they come to a place like this. That jacket's seen better days, hasn't it?" The man slowly wiped the spilled whiskey with his napkin, his face unreadable. He pulled out his phone and made a brief call, speaking too quietly for Marcus to hear. Within minutes, Sarah received a message that made her face pale slightly. "Marcus," she called out, her voice tight. "We need you in the office. Now." "I'm kind of busy here," Marcus replied, already turning his attention back to the customers he deemed more important. "It's not a request," Sarah said firmly. "Jake will cover your section." The man in the leather jacket remained in his seat, calmly sipping his whiskey as he watched Marcus reluctantly make his way to the office. Just before Marcus disappeared through the door, the man pulled out a small notebook and made a final entry, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The other customers, who had witnessed the entire scene, began whispering among themselves. Several of them knew exactly who the man in the leather jacket was, and they couldn't wait to see what would happen next. Marcus's reign of selective service was about to come to an abrupt and memorable end, but he still had no idea what was waiting for him behind that office door. The office at the Brass Rail was rarely used for staff meetings, especially during peak hours on a Friday night. As Marcus sauntered in, still believing this was some minor inconvenience, he found the small room already occupied by several people. The general manager, David, stood behind the desk with an unusually serious expression. Sarah was there too, along with the elderly woman who had been taking notes the other night. "Take a seat, Marcus," David said, gesturing to the only empty chair in the room. His tone was different from his usual friendly manner, carrying a weight that finally made Marcus feel slightly uneasy. "Look, can we make this quick? I've got customers waiting, and it's our busiest night," Marcus replied, remaining standing. His cocky attitude was still firmly in place, though a small bead of sweat had formed on his forehead. The door opened again, and Marcus turned to see the man in the leather jacket enter. Something had changed in his demeanor. He carried himself differently now, with an unmistakable air of authority that made Marcus unconsciously take a step back. "Actually, Marcus, your customers will be fine without you," the man said, closing the door behind him. "We have some important matters to discuss." David cleared his throat. "Marcus, I don't believe you've been properly introduced to Mr. James Morrison, the owner of the Brass Rail." The color drained from Marcus's face as the realization hit him. The corner guy he had been deliberately disrespecting for the past 2 weeks was his boss. His legs suddenly felt weak, and he gratefully sank into the chair behind him. I. Marcus started to speak, but Mr. Morrison raised his hand, silencing him. For the past 2 weeks, Morrison began, accepting a notebook from the elderly woman. Mrs. Peterson here, our operations director, and I have been conducting our quarterly staff evaluation. We do this at all our establishments. We observe, we take notes, and we learn how our bars actually operate when people don't know who we are. Marcus sat in stunned silence as Morrison opened the notebook and began reading. Day 1. Ignored 3 regular customers to serve a group of suits. Day 4. Made disparaging remarks about an elderly couple's drink choices. Day 7. Deliberately delayed service to anyone not wearing designer labels. The list went on, each entry making Marcus sink lower in his chair. His face burned with shame as he remembered every incident, every snide remark, every moment of disrespect he had shown. But tonight, Morrison continued, closing the notebook, tonight you outdid yourself. Not only did you publicly mock a customer, who happened to be me, but you created an atmosphere of discrimination that goes against everything the brass rail stands for. Sarah, who had remained quiet until now, spoke up. I tried to warn you, Marcus. I told you every customer matters here. The jacket you so eloquently criticized, Morrison added, touching his worn leather sleeve, was a gift from my late father when I opened my first bar 30 years ago. I wear it as a reminder of where I came from and what this business is really about, serving people, all people, with respect. Marcus stared at the floor, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. I'm sorry, he managed to stammer. I'll clear out my locker. Not so fast, Morrison said, causing Marcus to look up in surprise. That would be the easy way out, wouldn't it? To just fire you and let you take your attitude to another establishment. The room fell silent as Morrison walked around the desk, standing directly in front of Marcus. Instead, I have a different proposition for you. One that might actually teach you something about this business, about respect, and about what it really means to be a good bartender. Marcus looked up, confusion mixing with the shame on his face. He had been certain he was about to be fired, yet Morrison's words suggested something else was coming. The owner's next words would determine not just his future at the brass rail, but his entire understanding of the service industry. Mrs. Peterson picked up another notebook, preparing to document what would happen next, while David and Sarah exchanged knowing looks. They had seen this scene play out before with other overconfident employees, and they knew that what was coming would either make or break Marcus's career in hospitality. Oration. The office of the brass rail felt smaller by the minute as James Morrison paced slowly in front of Marcus, who remained seated and visibly shaken. The revelation that the man he had been disrespecting was actually the owner of not just this establishment, but several others across the city, was still sinking in. Let me tell you a story, Marcus, Morrison began, settling against the edge of the desk. 30 years ago, I was a barback at a dive bar downtown. I worked every terrible shift they'd give me, cleaned every mess, and learned every aspect of the business from the ground up. Mrs. Peterson, the operations director, opened a different notebook and smiled knowingly. She had been with Morrison since the early days and knew this story well. One night, Morrison continued, a man in an expensive suit came into that dive bar. Every other employee fell over themselves trying to serve him, ignoring the regular customers. But my manager at the time, old Jack Thompson, treated him exactly the same as the construction workers who came in for after-work beers. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair as the parallel to his own behavior became clear. That man in the suit turned out to be a wealthy investor. He was so impressed by Jack's equal treatment of all customers that he invested in the bar. That investment helped Jack expand, and eventually, he gave me the opportunity to become a partner. That dive bar became the Brass Rail. Morrison paused, letting the information sink in. Today, we own 6 establishments across the city. The Brass Rail, the Golden Anchor, the Silver Spoon, Capitol Bar, the Library Lounge, and yes, Marcus, the Purple Lounge. Marcus's head snapped up at the mention of his former workplace. You own the Purple Lounge? We acquired it 3 months ago, Morrison confirmed. Your former manager actually recommended you, saying you had potential but needed the right guidance. Now I understand what he meant. David, the general manager, stepped forward with a folder. We've been documenting more than just your poor behavior, Marcus. You have excellent technical skills, Your cocktail knowledge is impressive, and when you choose to be, you can be quite charismatic with customers. The problem, Mrs. Peterson interjected, is that you've completely misunderstood what makes a great bartender. You think it's about flair and showing off to the right people, but it's about consistency, respect, and understanding that every person who walks through that door deserves your best service. Morrison picked up the worn leather jacket that had been the subject of Marcus's earlier derision. This jacket has seen every success and failure in my career. I wear it to remind myself and my staff that appearances don't determine a person's worth. Some of our most loyal customers, who have supported us for decades, come in wearing work clothes after long shifts. Sarah, who had been quietly observing, added, "Those regulars you've been ignoring. They're the ones who keep us in business during slow seasons. They're the ones who recommend us to their friends and family. They're the heart of the brass rail." Morrison walked to the window overlooking the bar, where business continued as usual. "The customer you ignored last Tuesday, the one in the paint-stained overalls? He owns the largest construction company in the state. The elderly couple you rushed through their order last week, they're prominent restaurant critics. But none of that should matter, because in here, everyone deserves the same level of respect." Marcus sat in silence, the full weight of his misconceptions and mistakes pressing down on him. Everything he thought he knew about being a successful bartender was being turned upside down. "So," Morrison said, turning back to face Marcus, "now that you understand who I am and what this business truly represents, we need to discuss your future with us. That is, if you're willing to learn what real hospitality means." The room fell silent as everyone waited for Marcus's response. Through the office window, they could see the bar still bustling with activity, customers of all types mingling together, exactly as Morrison had always envisioned. The next few moments would determine whether Marcus would become part of that vision or remain stuck in his misguided understanding of the service industry. The tension in the office was palpable as James Morrison pulled another chair closer to Marcus and sat down, creating a more intimate atmosphere for what would become a transformative conversation. Marcus's earlier arrogance had completely dissolved, replaced by a mix of shame and nervous anticipation. "Let me show you something," Morrison said, reaching into his desk drawer. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound book that looked like it had seen decades of use. "This is every complaint and compliment we've received since the brass rail opened. Want to know something interesting?" Marcus nodded silently, his throat too dry to speak. "The biggest complaints aren't about wrong drinks or slow service," Morrison continued, flipping through the worn pages. "They're about how people were made to feel unwelcome. And in just 2 weeks, you've managed to add quite a few entries to this book." Mrs. Peterson stepped forward, holding her notebook. "Would you like to hear what some of your customers wrote about their experiences?" Without waiting for an answer, she began reading. "Felt invisible because I wasn't wearing expensive clothes. Bartender openly mocked my drink choice. Waited 20 minutes while others who arrived after me were served first." Marcus's face reddened with each comment. The evidence of his behavior was overwhelming, and hearing it read aloud made it impossible to justify or dismiss. "But here's what's interesting," Morrison said, leaning forward. "We also noticed something else. When you thought someone was important enough to receive your attention, your service was exceptional. Your cocktail knowledge is impressive, your technique is solid, and you have a natural ability to engage with people." David nodded in agreement. "You have the skills, Marcus. What you lack is perspective." Morrison stood up and walked to a wall covered in photographs. "See these pictures? Every one of these people started as a regular customer. Now they're business partners, investors, or lifelong friends. Not because they wore expensive suits or ordered premium spirits, but because they were treated with respect from day one." He pointed to a particular photo of a man in work clothes. "This gentleman started coming in after his shifts at the factory. He'd order one beer and sit quietly at the bar. Today, he owns 3 successful businesses and has invested in 2 of our locations. Want to know why he chose us? Because we were the only bar that didn't judge him by his appearance." Sarah, who had been watching Marcus's reactions carefully, spoke up. "Remember last week when you ignored that older couple? They've been coming here every Wednesday for 15 years. Their son owns 4 restaurants downtown. Word spreads in this industry, Marcus. Both the good and the bad." Morrison returned to his seat, his expression serious but not unkind. "So here's where we stand. You've displayed behavior that would typically result in immediate termination. You've violated our core principles and damaged our reputation with multiple customers. Marcus began to stand, assuming this was his dismissal, but Morrison gestured for him to remain seated. However, Morrison continued, firing you would be easy. Teaching you would be more valuable, not just for us, but for your entire career in this industry, so I'm going to offer you a choice. The room grew quiet as Morrison laid out the options. Choice 1, you walk away today, and we part ways. Choice 2, you stay, but you start over. Completely over. Not as a bartender, but as a barback. You'll learn every aspect of this business from the ground up, just like I did. You'll work every shift, serve every customer, and understand why each person who walks through that door matters. Marcus sat stunned, processing the offer. The thought of going from head bartender to barback was humbling, perhaps even humiliating. But something in Morrison's words had struck a chord. Before you decide, Morrison added, know this, I'm not offering you this chance because I enjoy teaching lessons. I'm offering it because beneath that attitude of yours, I see the same passion for this industry that I had at your age. It just needs to be redirected. The clock on the wall ticked loudly as Marcus considered his options. His entire understanding of success in the bar industry had been challenged, and now he faced a decision that would define not just his career, but his character. Marcus stared at his hands for a long moment before looking up at Morrison. The office had grown quiet, with only the muffled sounds of the busy bar filtering through the walls. After what seemed like an eternity, he finally spoke. I'll stay, Marcus said softly, then cleared his throat and repeated more firmly. I want to stay. I want to learn. The words felt strange in his mouth. Humility was an unfamiliar sensation for him. Morrison studied him carefully. Are you sure? Because this won't be easy. You'll be starting at the bottom. The same people you've been disrespecting will be giving you orders. Your pay will be reduced. Your hours will be longer. And every single customer interaction will be monitored. Mrs. Peterson opened her notebook again. Let's be very clear about what this means, she said, her tone businesslike. You'll work as a barback for a minimum of 2 months. You'll assist every bartender, including those you've looked down on. You'll clean bathrooms, mop floors, stock ice, and carry kegs. And most importantly, Sarah added, you'll learn to serve every customer with equal respect, regardless of their appearance or order preferences. No exceptions. Marcus nodded slowly, the reality of his choice sinking in. I understand. But he hesitated, then continued. Can I ask why you're giving me this chance? After everything I've done? Morrison stood up and walked to a small frame on the wall that Marcus hadn't noticed before. Inside was a worn-out bar rag, framed like a precious document. See this? Morrison asked. This was my first bar rag from 30 years ago. I keep it here to remind me of something important. Everyone starts somewhere, and everyone deserves a chance to learn from their mistakes. David stepped forward with a document. This is your new contract, he explained. It outlines everything we've discussed. Your new role, responsibilities, and the conditions of this probationary period. Take some time to read it carefully. As Marcus read through the contract, Morrison continued speaking. Your first shift as a barback starts tomorrow at 6 a.m. Yes, you heard that right, 6 a.m. You'll help with morning deliveries, learn our inventory system properly, and understand why every role in this establishment matters. The contract laid out specific requirements. Marcus would need to maintain a perfect attendance record, complete additional training modules, and receive positive feedback from both staff and customers. Any complaint about discriminatory service would result in immediate termination. One more thing, Morrison added, reaching into his desk drawer. He pulled out a small notebook, similar to the one Mrs. Peterson carried. You'll keep this with you at all times. Every day, you'll write down one thing you learned about service, about our customers, about the business. I'll review it personally every week. Marcus took the notebook, its blank pages representing the fresh start he was being offered. What happens after the 2 months? He asked. That depends entirely on you, Morrison replied. Show us you've learned. Show us you understand what real service means. And you'll have opportunities here you haven't even imagined. This isn't just about keeping a job, Marcus. It's about building a career. Sarah stepped forward with a familiar black vest, the uniform of the Brass Rails barbacks. Your first lesson starts now, she said. Take off the bartender's vest and put this one on. Sometimes moving forward means taking a step back. With slightly trembling hands, Marcus removed his bartender's vest. As he put on the barback vest, he felt the weight of his decision, but also a strange sense of relief. For the first time in his career, he wasn't pretending to be something he wasn't. Morrison extended his hand. Welcome to the real brass rail, Marcus. The hard work begins tomorrow. As Marcus shook his hand, he noticed something he hadn't before, a small scar on Morrison's palm, likely from years of handling bar tools and equipment. It was a reminder that the man offering him this chance had truly started from the bottom, learning every aspect of the business the hard way. The meeting was ending, the Marcus's journey was just beginning. Tomorrow would bring challenges he had never faced, lessons he had never considered, and a perspective on the service industry he had never imagined. The arrogant bartender was about to learn what it truly meant to serve. 6 months had passed since Marcus's life-changing meeting in the brass rails office. The early morning sun streamed through the windows as he meticulously arranged the bar for opening, his movements confident but humble. The leather-bound notebook Morrison had given him was nearly full now, each page containing valuable lessons learned over countless shifts. "Morning, Marcus," called out regular Joe, one of the early customers Marcus had once ignored. Now, they shared a genuine warmth that went beyond mere customer service. "The usual today?" "Coming right up, Joe," Marcus replied, already reaching for Joe's favorite mug. He knew now that Joe worked night shifts at the hospital, and these early morning drinks were his way of unwinding after saving lives all night. The transformation in Marcus hadn't happened overnight. Those first few weeks as a barback had been grueling. His hands had blistered from carrying ice buckets, his back had ached from moving kegs, and his pride had taken a serious beating. But something unexpected had happened along the way. He had started to understand the true meaning of service. Sarah approached him as he finished serving Joe. "Hard to believe it's been 6 months," she said, smiling. "Morrison wants to see you in the office after your shift." Marcus nodded, no longer feeling the dread that such summons had once inspired. Over the past months, his weekly meetings with Morrison had evolved from evaluations into mentoring sessions. The owner had taken a personal interest in Marcus's development, sharing stories and lessons from his own journey. Throughout his shift, Marcus served every customer with equal attention and respect. The designer suits and worn work boots all received the same genuine welcome. He had learned that every person who walked through those doors had a story, and part of his job was to make their story a little better, even if just for a moment. The evening wound down, and Marcus made his way to the office. Inside, he found Morrison sitting with Mrs. Peterson and David. The scene was remarkably similar to that fateful night 6 months ago, but this time, Marcus stood tall, confident in who he had become. "Take a seat, Marcus," Morrison said, his tone warm. "We've been reviewing your progress." He held up Marcus's notebook, now filled with observations, lessons, and personal growth. "Your latest entry caught my attention. Would you mind sharing it with everyone?" Marcus cleared his throat and recited from memory. "Today I learned that success in this business isn't measured by the size of tips or the complexity of drinks. It's measured by the moments we create, the respect we show, and the community we build. Every customer who walks through our door is part of our story, and we're part of theirs." Morrison smiled. 6 months ago, you thought you knew everything about being a bartender. Now you understand that the real art of service goes far beyond mixing drinks. Mrs. Peterson opened her folder. "Your customer feedback has been exceptional. Even those you once ignored now specifically request your service. Which brings us to why we called you here," Morrison continued. "We're opening a new location next month. The River House will be our most ambitious project yet, and we need someone who understands our values to help lead it." Marcus sat up straighter, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "We'd like you to be the assistant manager," Morrison said. "Not just bartending, but helping to build and train a team that understands what real service means." As the words sank in, Marcus felt tears forming in his eyes. "I don't know what to say," he managed. "Say you'll never forget where you started," Morrison replied, touching his worn leather jacket. "Say you'll teach others what you've learned. Say you'll continue to grow." Marcus stood and shook Morrison's hand, this time as a colleague rather than a chastened employee. "I won't let you down," he promised. As he left the office that night, Marcus paused at the bar. Joe was still there, finishing his drink. "Everything okay?" Joe asked, noting Marcus's emotional state. "Better than okay," Marcus replied, genuinely smiling. "Just grateful for second chances and hard lessons." Looking around the brass rail, Marcus saw what he had been blind to before, not just customers, but a community. Each person had helped teach him what it meant to be not just a better bartender, but a better person. His journey had come full circle, and now he would help others understand the same valuable lessons he had learned. The arrogant bartender who had once judged people by their appearances had transformed into someone who understood that true service comes from the heart, and every customer deserves nothing less than your best.